The message reached General der Artillerie, Walter Nehring's command post at 0300 hours on January 18, 1945. His chief of staff handed him the report with steady hands, but Nehring noticed the man's face had gone pale in the dim lamplight. An entire battalion, the 262nd Volksgrenadier, had ceased to exist as a fighting unit, not overrun, not surrounded, simply obliterated where it stood in the span of 12 minutes. Nehring had commanded armoured and artillery formations since the invasion of Poland. He'd seen what modern firepower could do to concentrated troops, but this was different. The report described something that shouldn't have been possible. 200 separate artillery concentrations falling with machine-like precision on German positions spread across nearly 5 kilometers of front. No ranging shots, no adjustment fire, just immediate, accurate, devastating bombardment that had caught his men in their defensive positions with no warning except the sudden scream of incoming shells. How many American batteries were involved? Nehring asked, already calculating what it would take to coordinate such a fire mission using conventional methods. His operations officer checked the radio intercepts and observation reports. Intelligence estimates between 12 and 15 batteries, Herr General. Perhaps 70 to 80 guns total. Nehring did the mathematics in his head. To coordinate that many guns, to calculate firing data for 200 targets, to synchronize the impact times across that many batteries using traditional artillery methods would require hours of calculation by multiple fire direction centers. The Americans had done it in minutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The technology that had destroyed Nehring's battalion represented a revolution in warfare that the German military establishment was only beginning to comprehend. At the heart of it was something the Americans called SCR-584, a fire control radar that could track aircraft, direct anti-aircraft guns, and, critically, perform a function that German artillery officers found almost impossible to believe. It could register artillery with precision accuracy in a matter of minutes, tasks that German methods required hours to accomplish. General der Artillerie, Walter Vollimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, had received the first intelligence reports about American fire control radar in late 1944. The descriptions seemed exaggerated. Perhaps Allied disinformation designed to affect German morale. American artillery units, the reports claimed, could register their guns without firing ranging shots, could coordinate fire from multiple battalions with unprecedented speed, could shift fire to new targets with minimal delay. Vollimont had shared the reports with his artillery specialists. The consensus was skepticism. German artillery doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, was built on methodical precision. Registration required careful surveying, test firings, atmospheric calculations, coordination between forward observers and fire direction centers. It was a process that took time because it required accuracy, and accuracy required time. The idea that the Americans could bypass this through some electronic device seemed to violate fundamental principles of artillery science. But the reports kept coming, and they were disturbingly consistent. In the Normandy fighting of June through August 1944, German units reported American artillery fire of unprecedented accuracy and speed. In the autumn battles along the German border, the pattern repeated. By December, when the Wehrmacht launched its Ardennes offensive, German commanders were beginning to take the reports seriously, not because they understood what the Americans were doing, but because the evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division in the Ardennes, experienced it firsthand on December 17, 1944. His division, one of the elite mechanized formations in the German army, was advancing through the village of Magaret when American artillery fire began falling with what seemed like impossible precision. His command half-track was hit within 2 minutes of taking up a position. His operations officer's vehicle was destroyed 30 seconds later. The fire wasn't random harassment. It was targeted, accurate, and it shifted from one tactical position to another with a speed that suggested the Americans knew exactly where every German vehicle had stopped. Bayerlein, who'd commanded armoured formations in North Africa and Normandy, understood artillery. This was different. The Americans weren't using forward observers, calling individual missions. They were hitting targets across his entire divisional front simultaneously, with an accuracy that suggested perfect knowledge of range and deflection. When he asked his artillery liaison how the Americans could be doing this, the man had no answer. German doctrine didn't allow for what Bayerlein was experiencing. The SCR-584 radar, officially designated Radar Set SCR-584 by the U.S. Army Signal Corps, had been developed starting in 1941 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory. The original purpose was anti-aircraft fire control, providing rapid and accurate tracking of enemy aircraft to direct anti-aircraft guns. But American artillery officers, always searching for ways to improve fire effectiveness, recognized another application. If the radar could track aircraft with precision, it could also track artillery shells in flight. The principle was elegant. Point the radar at a known landmark, a church steeple, a distinctive terrain feature. Fire a single artillery round. The radar tracks the shell's trajectory, calculates where it will impact relative to the landmark, and determines the exact correction needed to hit the target. What would normally require multiple ranging shots, careful plotting, and extensive calculation could be done with a single round and a few minutes of radar data processing. More importantly, once one gun was registered, an entire battalion could be registered to it, and multiple battalions could be coordinated to fire on different targets simultaneously. By late 1944, American artillery battalions in Europe were being equipped with SCR-584 sets and trained in their use. The doctrine was still being refined, but the basic capability was operational. Forward observers could call for fire on multiple targets. The fire direction centers could calculate the missions using radar-registered data, and the guns could deliver coordinated fire across an entire sector with minimal delay. To German commanders trained in traditional artillery methods, it seemed like magic. General Lieutenant Smilo Freiherr von Lüttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps in the Ardennes, filed a report on December 28, 1944, that captured the growing unease among German officers. American artillery, he wrote, demonstrates a capacity for rapid concentration and accuracy that suggests technical capabilities beyond our current understanding. Units report being engaged by precisely aimed fire within minutes of occupying new positions, with no apparent observation adjustment. Multiple positions are struck simultaneously with uniform accuracy. This represents either a fundamental advancement in fire control methodology or the deployment of technical devices of which we have insufficient intelligence. Von Lüttwitz was trying to describe something he didn't fully understand in terms that wouldn't seem alarmist, but the underlying message was clear. The Americans were doing something with artillery that German doctrine said shouldn't be possible, and German units were paying a steep price for it. The German artillery establishment had reason to be confident in their own capabilities. Wehrmacht artillery doctrine emphasized precision, coordination, and the careful application of firepower to achieve specific tactical objectives. German artillery officers were trained extensively in survey methods, ballistic calculation, and coordination between batteries. The German army had pioneered many artillery techniques, including the use of forward observers with radio communication, the coordination of multiple batteries for time-on-target missions, and the integration of artillery with armor and infantry operations. But all of these methods were built on a foundation of careful preparation and methodical execution. Registering artillery, the process of determining exact firing data to hit a specific point, required surveying equipment to establish gun positions precisely, meteorological data to account for wind and atmospheric conditions, test firings to verify calculations, and coordination between multiple command posts. Done properly, it produced excellent results, but it took time, measured in hours for a battalion, more for multiple battalions firing coordinated missions. The Americans German intelligence was learning, could do in minutes what took German artillery hours, and they could do it repeatedly, shifting fire from target to target with minimal delay. The implications were profound. Artillery was the queen of the battlefield, responsible for more casualties than any other weapon system. An army that could employ artillery faster and more accurately than its opponent had an overwhelming advantage. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff and responsible for the Eastern Front, received briefings on American artillery capabilities in January 1945. His response was characteristic: immediate recognition of the threat combined with frustration at Germany's inability to counter it. Guderian understood technology. He'd been an early advocate of radio communications in tank formations, recognizing that technical superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage. He'd pushed for the development of the Panther tank after encountering Soviet T-34s, understanding that Germany needed to match or exceed enemy capabilities, but by 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the technical resources, and the time to develop equivalent systems. Guderian knew this. What frustrated him was that German artillery officers were still trying to understand what the Americans were doing, let alone how to counter it. "We're fighting with 19th century methods," he told his operations staff, "against an enemy using 20th century technology. The artillery disparity alone would be crippling, even if everything else were equal." The SCR-584 radar system itself was a marvel of American engineering and industrial production. Each unit weighed approximately 10,000 pounds, requiring a truck for transport and a generator for power. The radar could track targets out to approximately 32,000 yards with an accuracy measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. For artillery registration, this level of precision was revolutionary. The system included a plotting board where operators could track the radar return from artillery shells, calculate impact points, and determine corrections. The entire process, from firing the registration round to calculating the correction, could be completed in under 5 minutes. American artillery units in Europe typically had one SCR-584 per battalion, allowing rapid registration for all the battalion's guns. More significantly, multiple battalions could be coordinated using a single radar registration, with firing data transmitted by radio. This meant that a division's entire artillery, potentially 48 guns or more, could be registered simultaneously and coordinated to fire on different targets with the same precision. The time savings were enormous. What German methods might take 6 to 8 hours to accomplish, calculating firing data for multiple batteries on multiple targets, American methods could accomplish in under 30 minutes. The first large-scale demonstration of this capability that German commanders could not dismiss or rationalize occurred during the American counter-offensive in the Ardennes in early January 1945. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, was attempting to organize a fighting withdrawal from the bulge his forces had created. His units were dug in, his commanders were experienced, and he'd positioned his reserves to counter American penetrations. On January 3rd, the American 1st and 3rd Armies launched coordinated attacks against the northern and southern flanks of the German salient. Von Manteuffel's headquarters received reports throughout the day, and a pattern emerged that his staff found deeply troubling. American artillery was engaging German positions across the entire front with what seemed like perfect coordination. As German units attempted to move reserves to threatened sectors, they came under accurate artillery fire within minutes of beginning movement. When German artillery had attempted counter-battery fire, American guns shifted position and resumed firing from new locations before German counterfire could be adjusted. The speed of American artillery operations was preventing German forces from conducting the kind of flexible defense that had been Wehrmacht doctrine for years. Von Manteuffel discussed the situation with his corps commanders on January 5th. The conversation, later recorded in after-action reports, captured the German command's growing realization. "Gentlemen," von Manteuffel began, "we face an artillery problem that is becoming tactical in nature. Our units cannot maneuver during daylight without coming under immediate and accurate American artillery fire. This is not a matter of American forward observers. We've dealt with those effectively. This is something else, something that allows them to engage targets across the entire front simultaneously. General Major Otto Remmer, commanding the Führer Escort Brigade, responded with frustration. "My men cannot move between positions without being struck. I've lost more vehicles to artillery in the past 3 days than to direct combat. The Americans seem to know where we are before we've fully occupied a position." The other commanders voiced similar experiences. The consensus was clear and alarming. American artillery had achieved a level of responsiveness and accuracy that German forces could not match and could not effectively counter. The technical details of how the Americans were achieving this remained unclear to German intelligence through much of January. Captured American artillery officers interrogated about fire control procedures, described radar systems and rapid calculation methods that German interrogators found difficult to believe. The descriptions seemed to violate the fundamental time requirements for artillery registration and fire coordination, but the battlefield evidence was undeniable. American artillery was hitting German positions with unprecedented speed and accuracy. On January 16, 1945, a German signals intelligence unit intercepted and recorded American radio traffic coordinating an artillery fire mission. The intercept, analyzed by Wehrmacht communications specialists, provided the first clear picture of American procedures. A forward observer called for fire on multiple targets. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged, and within 4 minutes, multiple American artillery batteries were firing coordinated missions. The German analysts calculated that using Wehrmacht procedures, the same fire mission would require a minimum of 20 minutes to coordinate, probably longer. The report reached Vollemont's office at OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, on January 19th. He read it with the cold comprehension of a professional staff officer recognizing a fundamental disadvantage. The Americans weren't just firing more shells, though they were doing that too. They were firing them faster, more accurately, and with better coordination than German forces could achieve. In an artillery duel, speed mattered as much as accuracy. An artillery battery that could engage targets and shift fire rapidly was far more effective than one that took longer to calculate and coordinate fire missions. Warlimont convened a conference of artillery specialists on January 22nd to assess the implications. The consensus was grim. American fire control radar, combined with improved communication systems and streamlined fire direction procedures, had given them a qualitative advantage in artillery operations that Germany could not quickly overcome. German artillery was accurate when given time to prepare, but American artillery was accurate quickly, and in modern warfare, speed was survival. One of the artillery officers at the conference, Oberst Heinrich Kittel, raised the obvious question: can we develop equivalent systems? Warlemont's response was brutally honest. Develop? Perhaps, given time and resources. Deploy? No. We lack the industrial capacity to produce radar systems in quantity. We lack the specialized components. We lack the time to train crews and develop doctrine. We're in a position where we understand what the enemy is doing, but cannot match it. The conference concluded with recommendations that amounted to an admission of helplessness. German artillery units should dig in deeper, disperse more widely, move more frequently, use camouflage more extensively. All sound defensive measures, but all fundamentally reactive. There was no offensive counter to American artillery superiority, except to destroy American gun positions before they could fire. And that required knowing where they were, getting close enough to engage them, and acting faster than American fire direction centers could respond. None of these were realistic, given the speed of American artillery operations. Through late January and into February, as German forces fell back under relentless Allied pressure, the artillery disparity became increasingly apparent. Wehrmacht units that attempted to establish defensive lines found themselves under accurate artillery fire within minutes of occupying positions. German counterattacks, which required concentration of forces, were disrupted by American artillery fire that seemed to anticipate every movement. The traditional German tactic of rapid concentration for local attacks, which had been so effective earlier in the war, it became increasingly costly as American artillery learned to respond to any concentration of German forces with immediate and accurate fire. General der Infanterie Gustav Adolf von Sangen, commanding the 15th Army defending the Rhineland, experienced the full weight of American artillery capability during Operation Veritable in February 1945. British and Canadian forces, supported by American artillery units, launched a massive offensive through the Reichswald forest. Von Sangen's forces were well prepared, dug into fortified positions with artillery positioned for pre-planned defensive fires. It should have been a battle where defense had every advantage, but the American and British artillery, using radar registration and centralized fire control, systematically destroyed German defensive positions before the infantry even advanced. Von Sangen's headquarters received reports of artillery fire hitting German strongpoints with precision, destroying bunkers, eliminating fighting positions, cutting communication lines. When German artillery attempted counter-battery fire, the Allied guns simply shifted position and resumed firing. The traditional artillery duel, where patient calculation and precise fire would gradually degrade enemy capabilities, had been replaced by something faster and more lethal. Von Sangen's after-action report, filed in late February, captured his assessment with professional clarity. The enemy demonstrates artillery capabilities that render traditional defensive doctrine problematic. Our positions are engaged with accuracy that suggests precise knowledge of coordinates. Counter-battery fire is ineffective due to enemy mobility and rapid re-engagement capability. Troop movements are detected and engaged with minimal delay. The cumulative effect is to render our artillery less effective and our defensive positions more vulnerable than doctrine would suggest. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical capabilities of the SCR-584 radar extended beyond simple registration. American artillery units discovered they could use the radar to conduct meteorological calculations by tracking shells to impact and comparing actual trajectories to calculated trajectories. This allowed real-time correction for atmospheric conditions, something that would normally require dedicated meteorological teams and hours of calculation. They could also use the radar to conduct counter-battery fire, tracking German shells back to their origin and calculating firing data for American guns to engage German battery positions. By March 1945, American artillery doctrine had evolved to fully exploit radar capabilities. Fire direction centers routinely coordinated fire from multiple battalions on multiple targets simultaneously. Time-on-target missions, where shells from different batteries were calculated to impact simultaneously, could be executed with precision that made them devastating to German positions. Forward observers could call for fire and receive accurate fire within minutes, allowing American infantry to advance with close artillery support that German forces found nearly impossible to counter. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Rapke, defending along the Rhine in March, watched his division systematically destroyed by American artillery, operating with what seemed like perfect information and perfect timing. His account, recorded in prisoner interrogation after his capture on March 11th, provided insight into the psychological impact of facing artillery they couldn't effectively counter. My officers reported that the Americans could hit any position we occupied within minutes, Rapke stated. We attempted to move at night, to use camouflage, to disperse. Nothing helped. The moment we concentrated for defense or counterattack, artillery fire arrived with accuracy that suggested direct observation, though we knew we were not being observed. It was demoralizing for the troops and frustrating for commanders who understood that we were being outfought by technology we didn't possess. The crossing of the Rhine in late March 1945 provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of American artillery superiority that German commanders would witness. Operation Plunder. The British and American assault across the Rhine north of the Ruhr involved over 2,500 artillery pieces. The bombardment that preceded the crossing was coordinated with a precision that German observers found almost incomprehensible. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who had replaced von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in March, received reports of the bombardment from multiple headquarters. What struck him wasn't just the volume of fire, though that was overwhelming. It was the coordination. Thousands of shells falling on German positions in carefully timed sequences, counter-battery fire that silenced German guns within minutes of them firing, interdiction fire that hit German reinforcement routes before units even began moving. Again, the entire German defensive scheme along the Rhine was being systematically dismantled by artillery fire that seemed omniscient in its targeting. Kesselring had commanded in Italy for 2 years, where he'd developed a reputation as a defensive genius, using difficult terrain and limited forces to slow Allied advances to a crawl. But Italy had been different. The terrain favoured defence, and Allied artillery, while plentiful, had to be carefully positioned and coordinated in mountain warfare. Here on the Rhine plain, American artillery operated with unrestricted fields of fire and technical capabilities that rendered German defensive positions transparent. "They can see everything and hit everything," Kesselring told his chief of staff on March 24th. "Our guns fire once and are destroyed. Our positions are engaged before they're fully occupied. How do you defend against artillery that knows where you are before you finish digging in?" The answer, as German commanders were learning, was that you couldn't. Not effectively. Not without equivalent technology and equivalent numbers. Germany had neither. The industrial plants that might have produced radar systems were rubble. The engineers who might have designed equivalent systems were scattered or dead. The training establishments that might have taught new doctrine were producing ill-trained replacements with a few weeks of instruction. Germany was fighting with the technical capabilities of 1943 against an enemy with the capabilities of 1945, and nowhere was this disparity more evident than in artillery. The psychological impact on German troops of facing American artillery fire was becoming a significant factor in combat effectiveness. Soldiers who'd experienced American artillery fire, who'd seen positions destroyed by seemingly instantaneous accurate fire, who'd watched German counterattacks broken up by artillery before they even reached American lines, developed a fatalism about exposure to American observation. If the Americans could see you, if they knew where you were, artillery fire would arrive with mechanical certainty. This wasn't the random harassment of artillery fire that soldiers learned to endure. This was targeted, accurate fire that found concentrations of troops, command posts, artillery positions, with speed that suggested the Americans knew everything. General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, documented this psychological deterioration in his daily journals through March and April 1945. His entries captured the progressive realization among German troops that they were facing an enemy with capabilities they couldn't match. March 14th. Reports indicate troops increasingly reluctant to concentrate for counterattacks due to certainty of American artillery fire. March 21st. Battalion commanders report severe difficulty maintaining defensive positions during daylight. Troops describe American artillery fire as arriving within minutes of occupying any position. April 3rd. Morale problems attributable not to cowardice, but to rational assessment by soldiers that exposure to American observation equals death by artillery fire with minimal delay. The technical explanation for what German troops were experiencing was straightforward, though few German soldiers understood it. American artillery forward observers equipped with radios and linked to fire direction centers that used radar-registered firing data could call for fire on any target within range and receive accurate fire within minutes. Multiple observers could call for fire on multiple targets simultaneously. The fire direction centers, using pre-calculated data based on radar registration, could coordinate fire from multiple batteries without the lengthy calculations required by German methods. The result was an artillery system that could respond to targets of opportunity with a speed that made American artillery almost like direct-fire weapons in responsiveness. German artillery officers, trained in methodical precision and careful coordination, found themselves unable to respond at equivalent speeds. A German forward observer might call for fire and wait 15 to 20 minutes for the first rounds to arrive, longer if the fire required coordination between multiple batteries. By that time, American targets would have moved. American counterfire would have forced German guns to relocate. The entire tempo of artillery operations favored the Americans, and German doctrine had no effective response. General Lieutenant Walter Lüttwitz, commanding the L-17th Corps in the Ruhr pocket, experienced this disparity in its most acute form in April 1945. His corps was encircled, cut off from supply, fighting with dwindling ammunition. American forces were systematically reducing the pocket, and American artillery fire was constant. What struck Lüttwitz was the efficiency of American fire. They didn't waste shells. Every concentration had a purpose. Every fire mission was accurate. There was no random harassment, no unaimed fire, just methodical destruction of German positions using artillery fire that seemed to know exactly where every German unit was located. In a conversation with his artillery commander on April 7th, recorded in the Corps War Diary, Lüttwitz tried to understand what they were facing. How are they doing this? How do they coordinate fire across the entire pocket? How do they know where our positions are? His artillery commander, Oberst Werner Hahn, had been analyzing American procedures from intercepted radio traffic and captured documents. His answer was technically detailed but ultimately simple. They have radar systems that allow instant registration. They have radio networks that allow instant coordination. They have fire direction centers that can calculate missions for multiple batteries simultaneously. We have none of these capabilities. We're fighting their 1945 army with our 1942 methods. The Ruhr pocket, where over 300,000 German troops were trapped by mid-April, became a laboratory for American artillery operations, with German forces unable to retreat, unable to maneuver. American artillery units could methodically engage every known German position. The fire was systematic, coordinated, and devastatingly accurate. German troops in the pocket described being under near-constant artillery fire. That's not random shelling, but carefully aimed fire that found command posts, supply dumps, troop concentrations. Surrender rates climbed, not because German soldiers wouldn't fight, but because fighting under constant, accurate artillery fire with no hope of relief or counter-battery support was simply unsustainable. General Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B trapped in the Ruhr, understood what was happening. A Prussian officer of the old school, Model had earned his reputation through aggressive counterattacks and fierce defense, but then by mid-April he was commanding an army that existed only in organizational charts. His units were out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of hope, and they were being systematically destroyed by American artillery fire that they couldn't see, couldn't counter, couldn't escape. On April 15th, Model dissolved his headquarters and told his staff officers to surrender or attempt to break out as individuals. He himself committed suicide on April 21st, unwilling to surrender, unable to continue fighting. The official German military analysis of American artillery capabilities came too late to matter operationally, but provided clear assessment of what German forces had faced. The Wehrmacht operations staff completed a study in late April 1945, titled Enemy Artillery Fire Control Methods, based on interrogations of captured American artillery officers and analysis of captured equipment. The study's conclusions were stark. American artillery could register guns in 5 to 10 minutes using radar systems. German methods required 2 to 4 hours. American fire direction centers could coordinate fire from battalion-level assets on multiple targets simultaneously. German coordination required multiple command posts and extensive calculation time. American forward observers could call for and receive accurate fire within 3 to 5 minutes. German forward observers typically waited 15 to 30 minutes for the first rounds. The cumulative advantage was overwhelming. In any artillery engagement, the Americans could shoot first, shoot accurately, and shift fire to new targets before German artillery could respond effectively. In offensive operations, American artillery could support advancing infantry with responsive fire that suppressed German defenses. In defensive operations, American artillery could engage German attack formations with fire that broke up attacks before they reached American lines. There was no aspect of artillery operations where German capabilities were equivalent, and artillery accounted for more battlefield casualties than any other weapon system. General der Artillerie Helmuth Weidling, who would command the final defense of Berlin, reflected on the artillery disparity in conversations with staff officers in late April. Weidling was an artillery specialist, trained in the careful science of ballistics and fire coordination. He understood what the Americans had achieved technically, and he understood that Germany had no response. "They've revolutionized artillery operations," he told his operations officer on April 24th. "Everything we learned, everything we practiced, is obsolete. They can do in minutes what takes us hours, and we have no counter to it except to dig deeper and pray they don't see us." The defense of Berlin in the final weeks of the war illustrated the ultimate futility of facing superior artillery without equivalent capabilities. Soviet artillery, which operated on similar principles to German artillery, methodical preparation and massive volume of fire, was devastating in its own way. But Soviet fire was predictable, concentrated on obvious targets, manageable through dispersion and deep fortifications. American artillery, in the accounts of German officers who'd faced both, was different. It was responsive, accurate, and seemingly omniscient in its targeting. You could hide from Soviet artillery by dispersing. You couldn't hide from American artillery because they seemed to know where you were. The final irony was that Germany had pioneered many of the tactical innovations in artillery operations that made modern artillery so effective. German artillery officers in the First World War had developed many of the techniques for coordinated fire. The Wehrmacht had been early adopters of radio communication for forward observers. German artillery doctrine emphasized precision and careful calculation. But Germany had failed to make the technological leap to radar-based fire control, and by the time German commanders recognized what the Americans had achieved, it was too late to respond. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, signed the instrument of unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. In the days before the surrender, as he compiled assessments of why Germany had lost, the artillery disparity featured prominently in his analysis. American material superiority was overwhelming. Everyone understood that. But the technical superiority, the ability to employ that material with unprecedented efficiency, was what had made German resistance ultimately futile. "We were outproduced, outmanned, and outfought," Jodl noted in his final report, "but we were also outthought. The Americans developed technical solutions to artillery problems that we didn't even recognize as solvable. By the time we understood what they'd achieved, we lacked the capacity to respond." In the prisoner of war camps that held German generals in the months after surrender, artillery capabilities became a frequent topic of discussion. Officers who'd commanded on different fronts compared experiences. Those who'd fought only in the east against the Soviets spoke of massed artillery fire that could be anticipated and partially mitigated. Those who'd fought in the west against the Americans spoke of something different, artillery fire that was faster, more accurate, more responsive than anything in their experience. The consensus was that American artillery represented a fundamental advancement in military capability, one that Germany had failed to recognize soon enough and failed to counter effectively. General der Panzertruppe Friedrich von Mellenthin, who'd served as chief of staff for multiple armored formations and experienced combat on both eastern and western fronts, provided perhaps the most analytical assessment in his post-war debriefings. American artillery superiority, he argued, wasn't just a matter of numbers. Soviet artillery had numerical superiority too. It was the speed of response and accuracy of fire that made American artillery uniquely devastating. On the Eastern Front, von Mellenthin explained, we could anticipate Soviet artillery. Their fire followed patterns. Their concentrations required visible preparation. We could often relocate before fire arrived. Against the Americans, there was no such opportunity. They saw a target, they called for fire, and fire arrived with minimal delay and maximum accuracy. It changed the entire tempo of operations. The technical details of the SCR-584 radar and American fire direction procedures became known to German officers through post-war intelligence sharing and technical briefings. Many expressed professional admiration for the elegance of the system. Using radar to track registration rounds was obvious in hindsight, but it required technical sophistication in radar design and operational doctrine to implement effectively. The Americans had done both, creating an integrated system that leveraged technology to achieve tactical superiority. Germany, focused on other technical priorities like jet aircraft and advanced tanks, had missed the artillery revolution entirely. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, captured in April 1945, participated in extensive debriefings about his experiences commanding Panzer Division. When asked what single capability had been most decisive in American superiority, he didn't hesitate. Artillery. Not the number of guns, though they had plenty. The speed and accuracy of their fire. We couldn't concentrate for counterattacks. We couldn't establish artillery positions without being counter-batteried immediately. We couldn't move reserves without being engaged. Their artillery made it impossible to conduct mobile defense. We were forced to fight statically, and static defense against superior numbers is just slow-motion defeat. The realization among German generals that they'd been out-innovated in artillery, a field where Germany had considerable expertise, was particularly galling. German artillery officers took professional pride in their precision and coordination. To discover that the Americans had achieved superior results through technical innovation rather than traditional skill was a blow to professional identity. It suggested that warfare had moved beyond traditional military expertise into a realm where industrial capability and technical innovation mattered more than training and doctrine. General Major Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, interviewed by American intelligence officers in June 1945, addressed this directly. We thought we understood artillery. We had excellent doctrine, well-trained officers, effective procedures, but you changed the game. You introduced technology that made our expertise obsolete. It's as if we were fighting with bolt-action rifles, and you appeared with automatic weapons. The fundamental capability differential meant that all our skill and experience couldn't overcome your technical advantage. The post-war German military studies of the Western Campaign devoted considerable attention to American artillery capabilities and German failures to counter them. The official history, compiled by former Wehrmacht officers working for the U.S. Army Historical Division, noted that German forces had faced numerous technical disadvantages, but few had the immediate tactical impact of the artillery disparity. German tanks might have been individually superior to American tanks, but battles were often decided by artillery before tanks engaged. German infantry might have been tactically proficient, but no amount of tactical skill could overcome being suppressed by accurate artillery fire. The study concluded with an assessment that was both technically precise and strategically damning. The American development and deployment of radar-based artillery fire control represented a military innovation comparable to the introduction of smokeless powder or breech-loading artillery. It fundamentally altered the effectiveness of artillery fire, allowing more accurate fire with less time required for preparation. German forces, lacking equivalent technology, were placed at a severe disadvantage in all phases of combat operations. No tactical or operational adaptation could fully compensate for this technological disparity. By late summer 1945, as German generals sat in prisoner-of-war camps or participated in historical debriefings, the artillery question had moved from immediate tactical concern to historical analysis. How had Germany missed this development? Why had German technical efforts focused on other weapon systems? Could Germany have developed equivalent capabilities if resources had been allocated differently? The answers varied, but a consensus emerged. Germany had been fighting the war it expected, building weapons for the warfare it understood. The Americans had been innovating, developing new capabilities that changed what was possible. By the time Germany recognized what had happened, the war was already lost for other reasons, and the artillery disparity was just one more advantage that made German defeat total rather than negotiated. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, in his memoirs written in captivity, addressed the artillery question in the context of broader German failures in technical innovation. "We built magnificent tanks," he wrote, "and neglected the mundane business of fire control radar. We pursued jet aircraft and neglected artillery coordination systems. We focused on wonder weapons, while the Americans focused on making conventional weapons more effective. The result was that our technical sophistication in selected areas was overcome by their technical competence across all areas. Their artillery superiority was emblematic of this broader failure." The German generals who'd experienced American artillery fire firsthand carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In reunions, in historical conferences, in interviews with military historians, the subject recurred. The speed of American fire, the accuracy, the seemingly omniscient targeting. Many described it as the moment they realized they weren't just outnumbered. They were fighting an enemy that had moved beyond them technologically. Traditional military skill, which Germany had in abundance, was necessary but not sufficient when the enemy had technical capabilities that rendered traditional methods obsolete. General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, who'd served as Chief of Staff to Rommel in Normandy and later to Model in the West, participated in post-war NATO military planning. In the 1950s, he advocated strongly for European adoption of American artillery methods and technology. When asked why, he described his experiences in 1944 and 1945. "I watched German units destroyed by artillery fire that arrived faster than we could respond. I watched counterattacks broken up before they started. I watched defensive positions eliminated before they could be reinforced. American artillery changed warfare, and any army that doesn't adopt similar capabilities is preparing to repeat Germany's mistakes." The technical legacy of the SCR 584 and American artillery innovations extended far beyond World War II. The principles of radar-based fire control, centralized fire direction, and rapid coordination of multiple batteries became standard in modern artillery operations. The speed and accuracy that shocked German generals in 1944 and 1945 became the baseline expectation for artillery performance in subsequent conflicts. The revolution that Germany faced, unprepared, became the foundation of modern artillery doctrine worldwide. In the final analysis, what German generals said when they realized the extent of American artillery superiority came down to variations on a single theme: recognition that they were facing a capability they couldn't match with a technology they didn't possess. Von Rundstedt's comment in post-war interrogation was characteristic. Their artillery was faster and more accurate than ours. In artillery engagements, speed and accuracy determine outcomes. We lost those engagements systematically because we couldn't compete technically. Kesselring was more philosophical. War is ultimately about applying force effectively. The Americans had developed means to apply artillery fire more effectively than we could. All our tactical skill couldn't overcome that fundamental disparity. Perhaps the most poignant assessment came from General Major Hans Rettiger, who'd served as Chief of Staff to Rommel and then Model. In a letter to a fellow officer in 1947, Rettiger reflected on what they'd faced. "We prided ourselves on our military professionalism, our tactical acumen, our operational expertise, and all of it was rendered insufficient by American technical innovation in artillery. They didn't just outproduce us, they outthought us. They identified problems in artillery operations and solved them with technology. We identified the same problems and tried to solve them with doctrine and training. Their approach worked better. It's as simple and as devastating as that." The story of German generals confronting American artillery superiority was ultimately a story about the collision between traditional military excellence and technological innovation. Germany had the former, America had both. In a war where material production, technical innovation, and industrial capacity were decisive, Germany's traditional military strengths proved insufficient. The artillery disparity was visible, immediate, and tactically decisive in ways that made it impossible for German commanders to rationalize or minimize. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.